I think I wrote it right when I moved back to South Bend. So in about 94.
Wow. Yeah.
It's ways back.
That's sounds a lot. Or the conclusion you came to in this paper is basically.
I think I wrote it right when I moved back to South Bend. Sorry, man. So in about 94.
What was it for?
I gave a version of I gave a talk on the subject at an APA, American Philosophical Association meeting in Kansas City in 94, I think. And someone commented on it, and I learned a lot in that comment. So I came back and redid it. So maybe I did it. It might have been 5. I don't know in terms of exactly when it's been.
Hey, John.
I hear.
Hello. Hello. Sorry I'm late. I'm on my new and improved phone, hopefully.
Cool. Your picture has gotten pretty two-tone though. There you are.
I'm post ice bag, hopefully.
Wow.
Nice.
We'll see what happens.
That's actually too bad. That was a very nice piece of that was a nice technological fix. Your phone overheats.
It's a breakthrough. We'll see. Maybe I'll still need one. But
I mean, I think Zoom calls just use a crap ton of energy because my iPad died while it was plugged in the other night for like half an hour. So.
Wow, it was plugged in and it died?
Yeah.
Hey, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe
I need a new setup. I need a new stand for my phone now that my ice bag's gone. So many
Reminds
things
me
to
of
figure.
Huey Lewis song. I want a new drug. A new techie drug. It's got to be for that.
Okay, things are going well.
Yeah, we got a good view of your ice bag or your non-ice bag.
That's my ice bag that was formerly. All right. Okay.
Cool.
We're gonna pretend that's good.
Trying to do things a little bit different, JP. I've got us recorded, both on Zoom and actually on YouTube. So.
Oh, okay.
So when hordes of people join us, we'll know where to look.
Okay.
Someday, actually, I'm going to prime the pump a little bit, and I'm going to see if some people can join, and we're just to see how the chat, the back channel chat works in a conversation.
Yeah,
it'd be fun to try it. So welcome, guys, and I guess it's the case that I should welcome everybody else. Welcome not just John Rose and John Loughran, but everybody else who ever tunes in to this Resurrecting Civility podcast. We are exploring a project. You'll hear more about that project in the course of today and throughout. But in general, it's about social information processing. And a bit more than that, actually. It's a pretty big project. And I've been working on it for a while. And John Rose and John Loughran, often known as JP, occasionally JR. For John Patrick Loughran, that is. So welcome, guys. Let's just dive in. This is an informal conversation about this project, and as you know, and as others might come to learn, we do a little bit of heavy lifting on the first and third times that we meet out of 3 each week, and then we do this more of an open conversation in the middle. And today is, of course, the third of those. And sometimes we read papers. We've only tried that once before I think, JP, your expression for that event was crash and burn. It didn't go
Might have been a little hyperbolic, but
not so much. But we took a look at a paper, but I don't necessarily want to go through that paper unless you guys do. I propose that we do a pretty big wash across a number of ideas and actually get somewhere today. And somewhere in there is the nature of the good. And that paper serves as background. And we can, anytime you want, we can dive into it, but there will be a natural time to visit it, I think, if we go through this agenda here. So we're going to do a quick sketch of all of reality in 3 slides, which is perhaps a little bit of a high resolution pass, as they say. Of course, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not exactly. I mean, this is pretty high level. You could call it, people who call it metaphysics. You know, what the heck is there anyway? And how do we know any of that? Mm-hmm. So metaphysics and epistemology. And we'll be taking a rough cut at an overview of those 2 questions. What is there and how do we know it? And we'll do it in 3 pieces. First, rooted in our information exchange paradigm, we'll talk about what goodness is. What is it for something to be good for you? And what truth is. There may be other senses of goodness, by the way, but I'm starting with that really primary one, the sense of well-being. You may have some kind of moral goodness or other things, and we could talk if we ever feel like it, about how to extend this primary sense into those other senses. But we'll talk about what good is and what truth is, what it is for something to be true in this information exchange paradigm. We'll do that first, and then we'll try connecting this whole view with conscious realism, which is pointed to in the previous paper we read by Donald Hoffman. And although we got bogged down in his argument, I don't think we got unbelievably lost in the general direction he was going in that paper. I think that was very clear. So we'll touch into that, and in 2 ways. I want to suggest first that there's sort of a suggestion. You can get a kind of suggestion that conscious realism, it is suggested by the lines of thought we'll be following. But I also think there's an argument for it that I want to explore at the end. And that's what I mean by first, these 2 things, this account of goodness and truth based on this high information flow network of rich communities, information processing paradigm. That account of goodness and truth we'll look at quickly suggests conscious realism, but I also think that it implies conscious realism, which is a much stronger thing to say than that it suggests it. So we'll take a look at that. And there's a lot there for today. If we have unbelievable amount of time, we could read a little Plato, because I think this is, I think we're in the neighborhood of Plato's Republic, but that's probably for another day. Just in case, I've got my Plato sitting here. Okay, so let's dive in. If you guys are okay with this, let's talk just a little bit about good and true. And it's in this context, when we talk about goodness, that we ought to, if the paper did anything for us, or if you raise questions you were hoping to talk about when we looked at that paper, this would be a good place. There'll be others, but this is a good place to do it. So because I'm talking to others, if I'm talking to others and this is the first time they've joined, they ought to go back and look at the first couple of videos probably that will help provide an introduction to this project. But the short version of it here is that this project is sort of an argument that we ought to live. We do in fact live in a network of communities that process information in parallel in these communities and then exchange information across various perspectives between these various communities. And we do in fact live in such an environment. It's just that we might suck at it because we don't recognize that that's what's going on. There is in fact this dynamic going on all the time, and I'm inviting everybody to take a look at it more carefully. To do that, we talked a little bit about what information is, and information, we said, is basically stuff that you consider that makes your choices better according to you, as a sort of a first grasp of what I mean by information. So information processing is just the stuff we do in our heads all the time in a way that is transparent to us. Now, there are folks who might think that all the stuff in our conscious mind is not where the action is. What's really going on in information processing is something very different, and consciousness is just either irrelevant or an emergent, and I forget the name of a supervenient property. Sometimes they use that phrase. It's a property that sort of sits on top of and goes along with, but the real action is down below in some neurological environment in which the consciousness only seems to us like it's what's going on. So there are people who hold that view, and we've started actually from a different premise, and it's important to acknowledge that up front, that we've started with the idea that the information we consider is actually doing some work when we think it does. Let's imagine that for a while, and then imagine that we are networked together, sometimes with people who are like-minded, and we may have a common view with them. We have a high nature of trust, and what they discover is sort of immediately relevant and useful to us if they convey it to us. And they might convey it to us by telling us about it, and then our own minds are fixed on those experiences, and that's a cognitive transfer, although a more efficient one, right? If somebody else goes and learns a lesson and then tells us a story, we get the point, and we didn't have to, we didn't have to go through the lesson, so it's more efficient, but it still takes time to process cognitively. Other times we said this happens without engaging our conscious understanding. Sometimes, as when people work hard in technology, for example, in material science, and present us with a range of choices, there's information, there is thought that went into, there's a reason why these technologies are the way they are, these materials are chosen, et cetera. But we need not know that or be in contact with that. We don't, frankly, we might take them for granted and never give it a thought and still benefit from the work they did, right? And our choices are still better and still responding to information, even though it doesn't require us to think about it. So all of that, that's the cognitive and non-cognitive dimensions of amassing information. And here I'm using a phrase that we've touched on, but not really used very long. And that is the idea of a tradition. And a tradition is something like a community that endures in time. And you can imagine that's plainly what happens with technology, right? It's been going on for a long time. And some of the people you could say we owe are people that have already died. And yet we still benefit, perhaps, from their technological innovations. And that's just technology. You can do the same thing in all kinds of other ways, including cultural development, curriculum, et cetera. A culture is something that makes things that are good look good. At least that's what it hopes to do. If you love your children, you remember the Sting song? I don't know if you guys happen to know if the Russians love their children too. It was a sort of a Cold War protest song. The idea is that they probably do. That's a suggestion. They probably love their children just like we do. So in that kind of global context of goodwill that's called up by that song, you can imagine that people shape cultures to benefit one another, to benefit their children at least, right? And that may happen across a long period of time in a tradition. We also talked very, very quickly about not only amassing, so far all of that was about amassing information inside a community. And if it lasts long, it's inside a tradition, right? But there's more than one of these. There's lots of different ways in which people can be united in their thinking about reality. And some of them are very different than others on a great many different points, perhaps. And so let me put it this way, aren't you giving away too much when you parallel process with like-minded people? Because there's all these other ways to look at the world, and you're not parallel processing with them. You're not engaged with them. You're engaged with people who think a lot alike with. I don't mean completely alike. This is a complicated business. But it is true that to the extent that you don't believe that somebody's got a clue, you're disinclined to be formed by them, either through either through their arguments. When they present things to you, you distrust them, right? Or by other, especially perhaps by the things they might do non-cognitively. You don't generally have trust in idiots, right? Or in bad people, right? Or in people who are really too different and just don't have a clue. And we know this only too well now because we tend to polarize very quickly today. Okay. Alistair McIntyre says, in fact, there is a way to exchange information. This is my way of putting what Alistair McIntyre says. He didn't talk about information processing, but there are, in fact, ways to compare traditions one to another and to actually benefit from the information stored in the other tradition. And that's by imaginatively entering into the second tradition. And that is not an easy dive to become a mature inhabitant, a second first language speaker, to use McIntyre's language. He uses both that phrase and the mature inhabitant phrase, so that you really belong in a certain sense. You really are one of those other guys, at least imaginatively. And the measure of whether you are is what they say about you when you interact with them. Right? They either accept you and they say, gosh, this guy knows a lot. Here you might recall, just to jump back into history for 15 seconds, Augustine runs into the Manichees and he runs into a guy. If I've got, what's the guy's name? I could easily misremember the confessions here. But he runs into the lead Manichean, and I'll have to pull up his name unless it pops back in my head another time. But he runs into this guy and everyone says, all the Manichees say to Augustine's very good questions, hey, those are good questions. We don't know the answer, but wait till this guy comes to town. He knows the answers. And this guy finally comes to town and Augustine puts all those questions to this guy. And the guy says, man, those are really good questions. I don't know the answer to those questions. A very honest guy, right? And a good old man who just does not understand, just can't answer Augustine's questions about the Manichean perspective. So Augustine leaves. That is a high level exchange. And there's a sense in which Augustine entered into the Manichean life. And how do we know that? Because their main dude, the phrase Simplicianus comes to mind, but I may be conflating him with another character in the Confessions. Anyway, when that guy says, you really seem to get this. I mean, you're asking just the right questions. I don't have anything to teach you, right? As a matter of fact, you're kind of teaching me something. You're teaching me that I actually don't know the answer to these questions. You've taken our way of thinking about as far as we know how to take it. Right. And a little further, because we hadn't seen these questions before. Right. When you get to that point, you're dealing with an adult. Right. And Augustine didn't get there overnight. But when he does get there, you might say he has been in contact with and is benefiting from whatever it is that tradition had to offer. Either that or the guys are too quickly and misdiagnosing him as an adult in that space. That's another possibility, right? That this guy he really doesn't get it, but I don't know how to say what's wrong yet. So you have to be very careful here. But eventually you could imagine that you could play the role of an adult in another tradition, and they say so. And when that happens, you are being formed by them and thus in contact with the information that forms their mature members, as well as in contact with the information that formed you in your original tradition. And now you're making a highly informed judgment, and not just an arbitrary judgment, an underinformed, but a highly informed judgment. And it may be the case that you may have enough exposure to both of these traditions so that no further exposure would change your attitude as to whether you ought to leave one of them behind and stay in the other, or leave the one you were reared in and convert in effect to the other. There may be a sufficient exposure, right? And a sufficient, it would have to be sufficient in the sense that it's actually achieved adulthood, it seems to me, although there may be earlier places of jumping across, by the way, but the only way that you could ever know that, even a kid gets enough of this other, even a kid could grasp this point, and this point sufficient reason to leave. But the only reason you could ever know that is by the adult who was fully formed in that tradition, who looks back and says, kid, everything you already know, even though you're not an adult yet in this other tradition, everything you already know about it is going to turn out to be all you really needed to know. Right? That's something that somebody who's fully formed in that other tradition is in a position to say to that kid. So there's an idea here of full information, not complete, but full information that can be grasped enough so that it no more affects which way you choose. That's the idea of full. You could just say adequate information, or there's other phrases, but it's full, reasonably full enough that it is all you needed to know to make a decision here. Okay, this is all McIntyre's work, okay? And that work enables you to ask the question for the first time of whether or not you can, in a network of communities, process information in a way different way than maybe we process it now, way more efficiently, where a bunch of people are working on the problems you're working on from your point of view, and you're working together, and you've got peers, and you can make headway from your point of view, and you get a lot done. But there are other people who have perhaps very challenging alternative ways of thinking about it. They're advancing their view, and their team, in effect, is getting stronger because it's parallel processing its efforts to come up with its account of maturity, just like your team is getting stronger with all of the parallel processing that's going on in your environment. And now we've got a new sport, right? The sport of processing information and improving our choices, not just from a single point of view, but from multiple points of view through some kind of shared, diverse social exploration. And that's just a really cool freaking place to stop for a minute, it seems to me. That's an interesting possibility. And the last bullet point under the first of these three is that these are things that are built really on a few simple propositions, coupled with McIntyre's analysis of the rationality of traditions. There's basically a rationality of a craft and what a community is and how crafts develop and how they accumulate. You could just say experience, but experience is basically information on this paradigm. We're just thinking about it in terms of information. But we ought to notice that thinking in terms of information processing and thinking in terms of computing is a relatively new game, right? Turing did it astonishingly well with almost no raw materials and very little computational science, but a lot of mathematics, right? And was able to crack, you know the story, right? Was able to put together a Turing machine. Was able to crack, Enigma. And how long ago was that? Not 100 years, right? But human beings evolved 200,000 years ago, and we've been working together, some people say in the last 500,000 years, with more advanced forms of language and even writing, although not what we consider writing in these modern days, only a few thousand years for that, perhaps. So we've been at this a long time, and all of a sudden here comes this computational paradigm, and man, the car just seems like it got started and the engine is running. So we think now, let's take that computational, let me call that a computational instinct, and look back at this cool little multi this little graphic up here, which has got 3 layers of networking that all related to one another in something like a hierarchy. And I'm not saying there's only 3 or that they're all the same or anything like that. It's just an image of multiple layers of hierarchy. And you can see that as multiple layers of information processing. And that's a new paradigm. And damn, we're on the edge of a nice idea here. We're on the edge of a new question, which humankind very generally has not thought about in this way. It does not have the resources to think about. Do we have a computational engine here, a social computational engine? And could we design it on purpose rather than an accident? Building on things that other people have already learned over history, but adding perhaps some new ways of looking at it. All of that is our context. Okay, that's just another way of putting. That's everything we've talked about in the last 2, or depending on how you talk about it. Now, what on earth does it mean for anything to be good for people? If this thing did run, would it be good for us? Or would it be dangerous? And what does it even mean for something to be good for us or something not so good for us? And then we could assign probabilities to those and start to talk about risk and danger, et cetera. How can we assess whether we have to assess it somehow if we're going to put it together on purpose and say, yeah, let's put it together this way. Well, why should we do that? Because it screws us up? No, that would not be the right answer, right?
Yeah. So what information are we looking for our model, right? I mean, it seems like we're looking for a particular set of information about the individuals in the communities, right?
Say a little more. What particular information does it seem like we're looking for?
Well, I mean, I don't think we necessarily have a good grasp of this yet, but it seems like, I mean, the information you're interested in is the information that determines that describes most accurately the well-being of the individuals in the community.
Yes. So you could say we're after particular truths. I'm getting ahead of ourselves, but we're to jump on material that we were going to touch on and notice shortly anyway. There are particular truths about what's good for us. And you might say that somehow, if we grasp those truths, we would be informed in some way, right? In very particular ways, we'd be informed about what our good is, right? Am I following along your line some?
Yes. I mean, I wasn't even thinking about, we would need to be informed about, we would need some sort of feedback, right? With regards to how things are actually going, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it seems, I guess, I think you are describing what I'm thinking.
Okay.
The line in which I was thinking.
Okay.
And so I think there's, as far as I can tell, there's really 2 types of information that really matter with regards to human well-being. And those are, I mean, the states of mind of the individual and events happening in the world seem like the 2 major categories of information that we would care about. And how do those 2 things interact to maximize the well-being for individuals? Seems like those are the classes of information that you would want to be informed about as you move forward.
Yeah. If information improves our choices, some of the information would have to be perhaps, I'm restructuring that. I'm trying to make the cut that you're making, but I'm making it maybe in a complementary or a slightly different way, the distinction you're making. if we're going to be, if our choices are going to get better because we're better informed, right? If our choices are going to be improved by additional information somehow, some of that will be information about states of affairs out there in the world, but some of it might also be information about ourselves, right? So,
Yeah.
hey, wait a minute, this is what I really want. I didn't realize I wanted that before, but I really do, right? And this is a means to obtain it out there in the world. So this is the right choice for me. I've brought together both of those kinds of information, right? Some of it is introspective and some of it is analytical about the way the rest of the world functions. The rest of the world is structured, or some subset of the rest of the world. That's not me, or that doesn't seem to be me.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that seems right. So I've never been precisely in this state before, where I've walked through in a lot of detail the nature of communities and traditions on an information processing paradigm in the way we just have. Okay, that's a very particular look. It's a particular way to order noticing a lot of different things. Okay.
Yeah.
So what I'm inclined to do is what I'm inclined to do is try out something that my instinct is telling me right, but I haven't tried it before. And it's something like this. Imagine that the good, what it means for something to be good for you is just whatever you're inclined to under these informed circumstances, or when this motor, this information processing engine is actually working. When it's feeding information to you, right? Somehow, when you're in an environment where you become informed by all kinds of things, and by what kind of things? By as many kinds of things as are relevant to the particular choice that you're making now. Enough so that no more would affect the choice that you make. Sometimes more information produces in us an anti-choice. We call it regret, right? We thought this was a good idea, but maybe we were just. It's a great song by Rush that I think your dad likes, JP. You didn't listen again. Maybe you know that song, or that's the phrase, and I forget the name. You didn't listen again, right? It's sort of like dumbass sort of is the theme of the song, right? Cranking
Yeah.
Rush. That happens sometimes, right? That we can produce regret because we just were the problem, to use that twofold distinction, looking inward. Maybe you just didn't look inward long enough. If you did, you'd have known, hey, wait, you jumped the gun every freaking time, or you turn down the advice of people who really love you every freaking time because you think you know better, right? Sooner or later, someone notices that about himself or herself and says, that's why that choice went wrong, right? It's something about me. Or it could be, I just didn't know enough about the world. I chose my major. This looked cool. This wasn't cool, right? This is just not interesting to me.
Yeah.
Right. I know and love somebody who got out of geology because she was in a class when they were talking about wells, the structure of wells in the ground and soil and stuff like that. And she said, this is not the wonderful love of rocks and minerals that I thought I was buying into. And that's it. She left. So that's, that's another sort of case. So sometimes in neither case did that person have enough information and process that information for them to make a decision which bears what mark. How about that there's an inclination that endures? As additional information rains in, it continues to confirm rather than erode the first set of inclinations that were elicited. So this looked real good and I jumped all over it. But boy, that was stupid, right? Because I didn't look in, or I didn't look out, or something. So maybe the good just is whatever you're inclined toward under something like full information conditions. And this is a full information theory, or and sometimes people call these informed desire accounts of good. One of the candidates, right? A candidate approach that we had looked at. And you can see sort of where that comes from. But it's pretty simple. The idea is the good is whatever you're inclined toward. It's just that there's a few more distinctions that need to be made. You won't stay inclined toward certain things, right? This is hot and shiny and you pick it up and it burns your hand. That was not good for you. It wasn't good for you because of something you didn't know about it. Right? If you did know about it, you wouldn't have picked it up. And it's not that complicated at a certain level. And how about the endpoint being, and here you need a structure to identify what constitutes the endpoint. And I think maybe you can see that if we're living in a high information flow network of rich communities and it's functioning really well, and there's all kinds of different ways to look at this thing, and there's way more information than we could possibly process ourselves, but the whole community, a community of diverse communities, all of which is processing this, exploring human alternatives from multiple perspectives. And the hope is whittling out some of the best options first from particular perspectives, and then at a higher level, better perspectives. And those take a long time to assess, but it's not clear that they're not accessible. And we've given sort of an algorithm for assessing that, one that should be explored further, but this is the second first language competency comparison algorithm, which I'm ascribing to McIntyre. So in that context, it kind of looks like you got a machine working for you and you could become informed. And there's sort of a limit here. And the idea of full information does not look crazy anymore. You got all kinds of resources. Doesn't mean you yourself have to consider all the information. That's impossible. But we left that a long time ago, right? In the idea of non-cognitive formation, or even learning from other people through a class, right? Which is a sort of a shortcut to cognitive formation. All of that stuff can happen in community. And when those communities last over time, you can get an awful lot of information, right? You can explore the obvious mistakes.
So okay. It seems like in this model, it would, in order for this model to work, there would still need to be some sort of, it seems like you would need to assume that people would eventually orient towards the same endpoint, that people are actually oriented towards the same endpoint, just using the information that they have, right? And whatever methods and whatever their way of life is, they're still trying to get to the same endpoint. And that they'd actually, like, what would it mean to, it seems like some people could just want different things, right?
They might.
Having the same information.
That is a possibility. I mean,
does that just mean they didn't get enough information, or does that mean, that's a question I have, is like, how do you know you have enough information? Like, when are you okay being like, all right, I know enough, now I can make my decision?
That's a good question.
Right.
That's a good question. And so is JP's, and I think they're not the same.
No, I don't think they are. I like John's question though.
I do too. It's a good question. Let's take them backwards. John Rose is first. How do you know when you've had enough information? This, after all, is about our world. So we better have an answer to that. right? There ought to be some cases in which we think we have an idea that we have enough information, right? So we could look at some clear cases, at least for early answers to that question. We would think that whatever resources a person has optimally, some people must have actually, right? For knowing when they've had enough. And happily, I mean, you guys have grown up in a tradition that I have. You've sort of come in contact with the idea of Ignatian decision making, right? Which is really pretty interesting. You make a pros and cons list, right? And you pay attention to what's going on inside you first, right? You pay a lot of attention to the desires that are at work in you. So it turns out actually these questions aren't entirely unrelated, right? Because you look at what it is you're after, and some of those things may or may not cohere so well with the world as a whole as you understand it. And that, I think, from a particular analysis of what the world as a whole is really like, namely Ignatian model of Christianity, right? That's the Ignatian exercises bring you to a place where you inspect your desires, you're aware of your desires, and you try to put them in some sort of sensible order that corresponds to what makes sense given what's really true about the world.
Yeah.
Right. And we could say more about that. We probably should sometime, because that's a really cool thing. But for now, a quick answer, not a long Ignatian answer. Right. So you set your desires in place, and then you write a pros and cons list if it's an ordinary time of making a decision. Right. In the exercises. And how do you know when you're done that process? Well, you've got some resources. Number one, you're not making this decision by yourself, hopefully. You're in the context of company of another wise person. And as a general rule of thumb, right, it certainly helps you to run a major decision past another human being and say, hey, look, this is how I'm looking at it. That could be just walking down the sidewalk with a friend and talking it out and hearing yourself say stuff, right? It might be getting a little bit of feedback from somebody like, wait a minute, I mean, you just buried all your whole sense of adventure. How important is that to you, right? Because you could imagine, selecting a job, selecting life with a partner, et cetera, in a way that kind of buries your sense of adventure. And you can imagine somebody pointing that out to you. Sure. All of those are two things or three things we do: careful introspection, making a very good pros and cons list, hitting it more than one time, probably, right? You don't do this very commensurate with how important the decision is to you. If it's a major life choice, like moving across the country and leaving one career and starting another, right? That's not something you do on a whim if you're going to make a good decision, right? And you probably get input from other folks. And then does all that guarantee that you make a decision you won't regret? I think, no, it doesn't.
No.
Right? It doesn't guarantee it. But
it makes it less likely.
It does. It cuts. Those are the strategies we have for cutting down on regret. I think so. And I think that's right. So I guess I want to say there's a difference between the concept having application. There is such a thing as enough information so that no more would make a difference. And we aim at that, and we often hit it, or we seem to hit it, insofar as we know people who proceed carefully and go through life without serious regrets. Now, part of that is we have adjustment strategies. So it didn't go the way I thought, but that's perfectly fine because there's nothing I could have done about it, right? If information comes at you and it's just, gee, I took this new job and then the company folded, because of something entirely unforeseeable by me. I looked at everything in that neck of the woods. The company still folded. I couldn't tell. You don't blame yourself for that decision. And in a certain sense, you don't regret that decision, right? In another sense, you do. You don't say, darn, you don't kick yourself and call yourself an idiot for making that decision. Not if you've got a level head about you. You made a good decision. It just sucked, the outcome. And sometimes that happens, and you know that, right? But that doesn't mean you're an idiot, or you shouldn't keep making decisions in that sort of way. It could have been a great decision from the point of view of what you had in hand, or what any human being could get in hand, ordinarily.
So is the best life the life with the least regret?
That's what I was thinking. This is
I think from this definition, because regret is to incline away from, not incline toward, right? I think when you regret something, you say,
well,
gee,
it's
I
like
wish I didn't do
retrospectively. It's retrospectively inclining away from, but the inclining towards is more of a present moment thing, I feel like.
Yes, although you can incline toward retrospectively also, right? You can just as well, you can revisit your decisions, and there you can be filled with gratitude, or filled with a sense of accomplishment, or it really depends on what perspective you look at it from.
Yeah.
But there's a bunch of things in that neighborhood, and you can say that was good, actually. And you can learn and gain confidence in your decision making and go on to take bigger decisions, right? And proceed with a measure of confidence because you get a lot of stuff right.
Yeah, I think regret's an interesting measurement, because we're pretty good at, or some people are pretty good at not having regret, or justifiably or not reordering it in their mind. Like, I'm glad I had this horrible experience because it made me the person I am today, or something.
That's right.
So there's different ways to think about. I mean, so was it still a bad decision, but you don't regret it? I mean, I think that's what you're just saying, but
right, that's possible.
So I don't know if it's a super accurate measurement for. I mean, if you think about it perfectly, it is, but.
Well, I think that you probably.
I mean, that it seems like that person's just being willfully blind to. I mean, they're just not choosing to be uninformed. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong. I mean, yeah, if you thought about it perfectly, maybe it's an interesting measurement, but people don't.
I think we're glossing over a couple different kinds of people, at least here. There could be people who actually don't know how to make a good decision, make bad decisions regularly, don't like beating themselves up about that, don't have any hope that they can fix it, right? You could imagine such a person, and then they make the best they can out of that, right? And at the very least, you ought to see that sometimes your bad decisions have good consequences, and you ought to celebrate those. That's a certain kind of person. That's not probably the kind of person you want to be, but there may be something about that person that you want to have. You'd probably, you want to learn from. A lot of things happen to you that you can't control. And if you don't get that message and learn to roll with those punches, it's just this person rolls with those punches all the time because he didn't pay attention. Reminds me of a John Wayne poster, John Wayne dripping with hand grenades and in a uniform, and the caption is "Life is tough, but it's tougher when you're stupid." I don't remember where that came from, but I've seen it. That's sometimes people put that up to remind you, don't be stupid.
Yeah.
Because we can make better decisions. So, John Rose, you're right to ask that question. I don't think we can ever know, at least. But I don't think that we have to be able to ever know with certainty in order for the concept to have application, in order for us to aim at it, and even in order for us to get reasonably good at it, but just not perfect because of the limitations of our information gathering.
Mm-hmm.
But now to JP's question about, in a sense, is there only one kind of person in these networks? And we're really somehow all the same in terms of what we actually want, right? And
yeah, if everyone was equally informed, would they actually want the same thing?
Yeah, that's right. We asked a question a time or two ago. We envisioned a small community of 7 people, all of whom are you. right? And how you could parallel process wonderfully in that situation, right? Because you wouldn't have to go, you could skip 1/7 of it, or you can right, skip 6 out of 7 of your meetings and send the other guys
Yeah.
to those, right, and come back. So that is sort of the limiting case, right, where they are literally you. And of course, that is not the normal condition. People are different from one another. The question is, how different from one another are they? And
Yeah.
there, you'd have to. That's a really interesting question, right? It's kind of like a chemical question. You could look at rocks and minerals and see all kinds of things that look very different, but you might wonder if there are underlying ingredients here that if you did some analysis, some chemical analysis, you could break it down into a certain number of kinds, right? But those
Yeah.
kinds combine and they weather in various situations, and it's like that, and people are like that. And you could take the very same you and raise that you, not in a community with 6 of his clones, but in radically different places, right? And in some ways, it's the same you. At least it'd be the same genetics. You could imagine dividing identical septuplets this way, right? And
Right.
and radically changing their environment. And you might end up. It's a good question. How much is nature versus nurture is obviously the catchphrase we're exploring in this case. In that particular case. And you might imagine some things really come, those desires get inculcated through your experiences. And if you had a deep childhood experience, a love of something at a certain age, could be, it matters what order you get exposed to these things in. Right. And so somebody, even if they could have been like you, is not in fact like you. Even your clone could have been like you, but is not in fact like you. And then maybe we're also different in nature, not just in nurture. And maybe there's genetic differences, and maybe some of us are really prone to love adventure, for example. I mean, I think that's the case. Other people tend to be more, relationship oriented, safety, want a lot of information. Some people really like a lot of information, that they become accountants and they think that's pretty cool to order all these things. Other people could care less about any of that, and they just want to hire one of those persons so they don't get in trouble. Right? Because they keep track of stuff that they hate keeping track of. So there are different types of those may go also, those differences, maybe they're genetic or epigenetic, right? To make it even more complex, a combination between nature and nurture and epigenetics. But anyway, all of that difference, why suppose that human beings are just alike? Well, we'd have to actually have a theory of human kinds. What different kinds of human beings are there, and how do you tell them in what kinds of circumstances, at what kinds of stages in upbringing, and in what kinds of conditions of upbringing? And how can you look through and identify that these are different types of people, and they may be very complex different types, right? How many different ingredients are there here? Right? How many different sort of basic desires might there be? And how tutored differently as a result of different kinds of exposure, right? At different stages in life, with different friends, with different social groups. I like this because this is what my friend and I used to do. It's got a great memory for me.
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine that. And there it's not even just you. It's the little community that you were part of. That is the reason why this is a much more meaningful thing for you. You love small group discussions, maybe, because you have good memories of them and you're good at them.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like it would be awesome if you would be able to map that onto the brain somehow, right? And sort of control for those differences in a measurable way, right? Where it's like like whether or not someone is experiencing what is it has a higher or lower well-being, right, will probably manifest itself somehow in some sort of neurological activity, right? This is sort of what I was thinking about it, is sort of because it seems like some people's desires, you know, I mean, it's hard to say how informed different people. I mean, different people could be equally informed and still want different things, and that's one thing, right? I mean, some people could just, you know, decide they don't care about other people, right? You know, you could or it could just not be very important.
Right. Yeah. I don't know whether your statement is true, but I do understand that your statement is of a class that's worth considering. You'd have to investigate whether it might, for all you know, right? Maybe some people just are not wound to care about other people, if I'm following your suggestion.
Yeah.
Somehow that's not what floats their boat, as they say, right? Maybe,
Yeah.
or maybe not. Maybe whenever somebody doesn't care about other people, it's always because they've been deprived of certain experiences, which were they to have had, they would now care about other people. That's a possibility. And then there's the question of, can you fix that? Or do you have irreparable damage, right? Or are there strategies for fixing that? Some new set of experiences, different than the ones they missed, but not unrelated to the ones they missed, that affect the repair. This is the craft of interacting with human beings we're talking about here.
Right.
Like, how do you fix them? What's broken? How do you fix it? And these are all great questions.
I mean, clearly not to get too far down that rabbit hole, but I mean, it's pretty impressive how many things can be remediated in situations where people are developmentally scarred in some way. That's not exactly what I was trying to get to. I guess my inclination, I want there to be something more objective you could say than someone's desires being fulfilled. Like, I wish there was something you could measure more directly, because you can't really measure someone, like, desires are, I mean, you're almost running into it seems really hard to quantify desires and map that onto well-being. And my desire is for there to be something more objective that you could measure that would capture well-being in the way that we want.
Sure.
That's really.
Yeah, this is very cool, and I get that. And one of your instincts was to go to neuroscience, and although I know little about it, I do know that you're going to run into neuroplasticity there and biochemical individuality there, right? And so not everybody's brain is going to work the same just because of little developmental differences, right? And so it's a good question whether you'll be able to tease out at a higher enough level of abstraction some general rules about how the brain operates. Is there a certain hormone, right? Is there a flush of serotonin or something like that you could quantify, that you could measure? Maybe, right? I think actually that there is progress that's made in that space, and that's a great space to look at. You could also just talk to people, right? And you could analyze them. Maybe you could psychoanalyze them. And of course, there have been approaches to treating people like that too. Some kind of psychoanalysis. there's a guy at the University of Chicago who is a leading advocate of Freudian psychoanalysis, but all that he has left, and I've heard him a couple times. I've actually talked to him, but I might get him pretty wrong. His name will pop into my head any minute. He's a huge philosophical figure, actually, at the University of Chicago. Let's see. His claim is that it's the deep listening to people that's the magic in psychoanalysis, is to actually deeply listen to them. And I think to put a few more words in his mouth that I know belong than that I know he said, my impression was that when you learn and deeply listen, you elicit self-reflection and honest communication, and that is enormously therapeutic. So if you were good at that, maybe you could go after and really get at what people really want that way, and whether they're really satisfied that way, simply by asking them, are they satisfied?
Yeah.
Right. But there's a lot of crap to cut through there too.
Yeah. A really popular podcast right now is called The Happiness Lab, and it's taught by done by Laurie Santos, who's a professor at Yale, I believe, and she teaches the most popular class at Yale, the Science and the Good Life, or something like that.
Yes.
She's
been on Sean Carroll's
not quite right
podcast, if I remember correctly.
Sean, yep.
Her, which is where I heard her, but I haven't heard her.
Her podcast is great, but one thing that is a pretty consistent thing that emerges in the podcast is that people have really bad intuitions for what will actually make them happier. Right?
Cool.
So, like, and there's a few examples of this, like, should you spend money on yourself or give money to other people? Should you, how should you view your experiences retrospectively? How should you develop rituals? But people basically have a very bad idea. Like, people are just generally bad at actually knowing what's going to make them happier. Right? Mm-hmm. And like, our intuitions are really bad in that area. And so the only reason I bring that, what'd you say?
Did she talk about why they are? Why are our intuitions bad? Because they could be bad because they're tutored, or they could be bad because human beings cannot produce any reliable intuitions under any circumstances.
Yeah. It seems like their intuitions are reliably bad, though. I mean, maybe that's just because there's more wrong answers than right answers.
In general, we prefer more immediate happiness than long-term, and then the long-term is typically leads to more happiness. So even if we could know, we're just bad at selecting.
Yeah.
Right.
Which gets to another, I think, interesting sort of asymmetry where there's sort of happiness in the moment, like John's talking about, like what would actually be pleasant, right? Like, you could imagine being somewhere like New York City or something like that, right? It might be really pleasant to just go sit in a cafe and enjoy some good food, and you don't really actually have that much energy in the moment, and you just kind of want to hang out and have this super chill day downtown, right? And so that's one element. Like, you would just enjoy it in the moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another element where you want to go out and do things that you would do in New York City, that you ought to do. You know, like, you should go see the Statue of Liberty or something like that. And why would you do that? So you could tell a good story later about it, right? Or it's just something you ought to do, right? You just have these ideas about, like, how do you want to actually remember this experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you want to remember it, right? And so you have this sort of two separate things in yourself competing for what would actually be better, right?
Yeah.
in the moment, and in the moment versus as you remember it, right? And so, and that sort of gets into Kahneman's ideas about the, you know, the two types of self. We have the remembering self and the I can't remember the other self now, but I don't know. It seems like it's really hard to know what is actually what ought people desire. It seems like there's two different things you could desire, both reasonably.
Sure. So I suppose that we should make some distinctions. There may be a wide range of things that one might desire, and any of them are fine directions to go, in the sense that none of them are occasions for regret, or at least not serious regret, right? I mean, it's not serious regret when you find out that, boy, that was a great trip. I wish I'd taken that one, but what I took was also wonderful, right? On a sightseeing tour, you know what I mean? It's there are different types of regret based on information that you just didn't have at
but
the
it seems
time.
like as soon as you're talking about regret, you're immediately prioritizing the remembered experience of it.
That might be true. One might be forgiven for that because the instantaneous experience is very short-lived, and the retained experience is, at least in terms of number of times you visit it, you might say there's quite a bit. These days, I think that's so much why so many of us love to bring phones with us, because you can capture the experience, and what you can trade away a little less vividness, right? You can take some of the vividness with you. with technology, you can pull some of the vividness with you and refresh your memory that way. Anyway, you're right. Maybe I was prioritizing that.
Because it seems like if you look at like how on earth you explain the bliss that people experience who are just who live in caves and meditate all the time, right? I mean, they just pay attention to their own breath for 20 years and they're like, my life is awesome. You know, it's like they're just, I mean, it seems like that whole practice is the practice of just being in the moment, right? You just hear there's so much of this language of where if you actually just threw yourself into your moment to moment experience, you would actually have a great life.
So I'd want to know somebody who knows the joys of rappelling with friends down a mountainside, right? And seeing incredible, I'm talking about adventure and joy and companionship and all that comes from that, right? And I'd want one of those guys to be somebody who spent 10 years with the desert monks, right? And can deeply explain the beauty of that sort of isolation, and would have something to say about the two of them, about those different
right.
That's where I'd look for when you say, how do you explain? I'd say, well, first, how do I even comprehend? And I'd listen really carefully to somebody who's been there for 10 years, but not somebody who's only been there for 10 years, has been only there for 10 years, right? But somebody who's been other places too and lived other ways.
I guess my point in bringing him up is that there's really is, it seems like two ways to really experience a lot of well-being in your life. Sort of prioritizing your skill set to collide with the present moment. And I'm using that as in terms of like the desert fathers, or someone who's, you know, really ascetic living, right? Like yogis or whatever, right? They're like, they don't actually aren't really gathering experiences to remember and regret, right? I mean, there's the absence of them, I guess, that they might regret, but they're just focusing on being present in that moment and seeing each moment as it goes by, right? And so,
true,
as opposed to this measuring your decisions over time and reflecting on how much you regret them, it's sort of a remembered measurement of well-being.
Yeah, interesting. there's also the possibility that there may be people for whom the very notion of a difference between good and not good has different meaning. And I have not been raised in such a tradition, but my impression is that there are traditions that have a very different take on the reality of the differences in. They're not so inclined to order the world to produce one state of affairs rather than another state of affairs. They're more inclined to just let the state of affairs come and see, to be more indifferent to them. And I have to admit, I don't identify with that, but I'm quite eager to learn from them. It's not high on my list to learn from them, simply because I don't know enough about them to know how to rank order the discovery of what they have to offer. Anyway, and so that might be part of that mix that you're getting at. I'm surprised to hear you say, that I don't know why living in the moment doesn't. Why living in the moment is sort of more the mystical. I could imagine somebody who lives in the moment and is quite active. You know what I mean? And changing, and impulsive, and shaping the world, but is really vividly engaged, as opposed to somebody who takes a lot for granted and only thinks about things that are way out there that they hope to achieve someday, and overlooks all the wonders right in front of them. At least you can imagine such a person, and maybe we're like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I honestly, I think that is the better way to be. I mean, I guess I was just putting it out there as this sort of counterexample of people claiming to really experience a lot of well-being in their lives without really gathering experiences to measure against in the same way that sort of we're talking about, right? I mean, maybe they're gathering internal experiences to measure against.
Well, bear in mind, people might be brought up in a tradition in which they have, there could be a lot of non-cognitive formation in someone's upbringing, right? For better or for worse is another question, but they might think, there's a reason I don't explore all these other things. I don't compare my state to every other state all the time I could be in, as if I'm constantly needing to decide. I simply accept, right? And I move with the flow, and I enjoy the reality of it all, or something like that. I don't know how to play that role very well, but someone who were playing that role might not have determined that through some cognitive exploration, but rather through some non-cognitive formation in a tradition. That's a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a possibility. It's, I mean, it seems like people do it for other reasons too. I mean, we don't need to keep getting it. Fundamentally, I'm talking about something I actually don't know very much about.
Sure, me too.
I'm sort of just posing it as a counterexample to the regret model.
Yeah, but it's useful. So I don't actually have regret in this model, but it comes up pretty quickly, so it's not far away. All I'm suggesting here is that we do incline toward some things and not toward other things, and we do tend to think that we seem to have evolved in such a way, right, as to not step in front of the bus, because that's a bad move, and you would regret it. I think we would regret it. It would be dead, maybe in the worst case, and then other people around us would regret it imaginatively. Boy, I'm glad I didn't step in the bus, and I never in front of the bus, and I never will. Right? I'm going to be a little bit more careful, or maybe we just suffer from the consequences of our fairly foolish activity, right? And then we learn we should look before we leap. And that process of looking before you leap seems deeply a product of natural selection in it, that we do somehow look before we leap. And that looking is information gathering. And the question is, how much do you need? And we're trying to get as much as we can, and we try to get it from other people. And we don't want to assume that we're just like other people, but neither do we want to assume the differences between them and us are render their experiences irrelevant to our assessments of our own futures, right?
Yeah.
It could be that that were I to understand this very different person than I am, I would come to see merits in thinking about it from another perspective. Something like that. That may take some time to grow in that exchange. Okay.
I think that makes sense to me. But I think, I guess what I want to just sort of put in the context of this is that it seems to me that the Buddhist way of thinking is sort of, in sort of a large ethos of way of thinking is suppression of that of desire and grasping.
Yeah.
Right.
And is that,
so,
is it fair to ask, is that a way they're inclined to go? Might they look on the inside, see certain things about them and say, these strains inside me are not the right path, and that I ought to quiet them, right? And not attend to them, and attend to something else instead. And you might imagine that that's itself an informed inclination, either through either a deliberate choice amongst other options, or something that's brought to you from other folks and is relying on other people's experiences, and you've been formed in a tradition non-cognitively. That's possible too. You've been brought up that way.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I see how it makes more sense how it fits in. I mean, you're deciding to quiet them. You're inclining to quiet, to stop grasping, I guess.
Different ordering of desires.
Maybe it is, or maybe that would really have to ask people from that tradition who were deeply in touch, right, with the difference between what they actually do and what it is we're now describing like rookies.
Yeah.
Right? Without really knowing what they're talking about. But I agree, we should stick a pin in these issues. We certainly don't want to come up with, put it this way, if we've got sort of a metaphysic of no, there really is some sort of good here, so we say, but it doesn't map onto a rich range of people's experience of the good, right? And that it's sort of parochial and associated with some traditions and not others. We'd want to be obviously very careful about that. It wouldn't follow that it's wrong, but it would follow that we'd have to do a whole lot more work to develop confidence in it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Would probably have to be able to look at things from other people's points of view where they throw out all this machinery, right? Could we live without it? And we'd have to try that on for size. Or maybe they could live with it too. And we simply have to ask them.
Yeah.
Okay. So because we don't always know, there's a subjective variant of this definition of the good. It's what you would incline toward were you fully informed, adequately informed. And what that really means in this high information net flow network of rich communities enduring across time is it means, were you formed to maturity in a tradition that endures through comparison with all of these rival traditions. There may be multiple ones that endure in these comparisons, and there could be incommensurable answers to the question, right, of how to be a human being or what do human beings really want. It might depend on how which of these richer, more stable traditions you're brought up in. I'm not trying to prefigure the argument, although I do think it would be very interesting, right? It certainly would be an interesting comparison, this, if were it possible, this full information exchange comparison. And you might wonder whether some sort of synthesis might come, right? So that there's in fact not two, but one overarching way of looking at the world that includes these, that enables people to come together in respect for, in not just respect. You can achieve respect for complementarity, but you might be really opposed to one another nonetheless, right? But you might imagine that there's some natural quest for some kind of common understanding and common way forward. And you might want to maximize that, but maybe that's, I'm inclined to think people do want to maximize that, actually. That's another argument. So for now, but it could be that there's just that's what happens. There could be rival scientific theories of the world, right? And they both have enormous amounts to say to them for themselves. I once met a surgeon who was an acupuncturist. And I asked him on the sidelines of a soccer game, I've always wanted to have this conversation. I can't believe I get to have it, right? How do you put those two things together? Right, because an amateur amount about key flow, and had a little bit of martial arts toying with that way of thinking about the world, right? And it's not like the sort of science that I had grown up in the West. And here's a guy who knows them both, and he says, I don't have the slightest idea how they come together, and I don't ask. They both work. We just grab something from the toolbox. That's what he said. So that was a disappointment. Okay.
Yeah.
I forget even how I got on that, but it was a fun story. There's a subject, and let's leave good behind for a moment. There's a subjective variant. In other words, the good is what you would incline toward, but it could be that what is it for you to become fully informed? It's to be formed in a tradition. First of all, you can't do it by yourself, right? And not just any tradition, but a tradition which has got enough resources to endure, right? And have people continue to say, you know what? I'm inclined to stay here, even though I know what it's like to be there. And maybe I learn some things and bring some things from my journey there. And now I'm in a somewhat new place, although perhaps it's a good question what constitutes, is every little change in a tradition a new tradition? Probably not, right? There's probably some recognizable continuity of story, and you bring resources in, right? And you enrich it, but somehow it seems like it stays the same thing instead of like a radical conversion where you have to throw out everything you thought you knew, right? To live a totally different way. That's a bigger change, right? So all of these kind of interactions have all kinds of different well-informed exchanges, and what it is to be well-informed can't be specified on this account except in the context of a tradition.
Yeah.
So the good is a tradition-bound concept, and there may be rivals, different tradition-bound accounts of the good. That's quite possible, but there may also be an emerging richer accounts that take into account and overcome. And we haven't talked about, McIntyre says a lot about how that goes. I gave a simple case about how, two people exchange and enter into second first language competencies in one another's traditions, and they may choose the same way, right? Well, why would they? There's a lot to be said about that, and we'll come back to that another time. Let's just say there's a whole wealth of what McIntyre has to say there, and I've only scratched the surface. Just to suggest that maybe, just maybe, there's an algorithm for information exchange at work here that we could at least explore and try. Okay, so let's leave behind good for now. Right? It's a tradition-bound full information approach to good on this model. And maybe it's the case that human beings, although maybe we could give a theory of kinds of human beings there's various variations of human beings, but there may be some common experiences that could be brought out that would be common to any person who achieves maturity in a certain kind of tradition, a certain kind of well-informed, richly informed tradition. And there we're pointing toward something like the natural law. We might want to say that there's some universals here. Maybe it's the case that you end up respecting every person if you're formed to maturity well, right? Because you see, etc. Again,
that's because, I mean, when you say the good is tradition bound, right? I mean, I feel like the natural, there needs to, that it seems like then the good is basically the most informed. You're just approximating it, right? Like, I guess I'm still a little bit confused on this, on what we're actually saying the good is. I think we've described a structure towards going towards the good.
Why don't we stay on it then? I'll tell you what. Let me take one tiny next step and then come right back to it, because I think they come together very well. But we'll end. We'll spend our time talking about just this. All I want to say that there's one more step. It's prefigured already, is that in your analysis of the world, right, you've got a set of conscious experiences, and you think you know what's going on with yourself and with things outside of you. At least in some sense outside of your experience. You experience them, of course, right? But you certainly don't control them. And some of them seem to be just like you, only different, right? Like you and I, right? We're other persons, right? So we think of that as outside ourselves, even though in another sense, it's still inside our field of consciousness, which is pretty interesting. Still, we make judgments about that. Right? Like, oh, John just dropped from the call. He can't hear this. That may be true or it may be false. It could be I've hit the wrong button. And I just can't see John anymore. He might be there or he might not be. And I may make judgments based upon that. And in fact, some of my judgments might not be good ones. I ignore John because I thought he wasn't on the call anymore, right? Or I say something, I laugh at John or something. Oh, he's not here, or whatever I did. My point is, those are things that improve our choices. Our knowledge improves our choices. Is it knowledge? What is it for it to be right about whether John has dropped from the call or not? What is it to be right about whether this would offend John or not? Right? What is it to get it right? And I'm suggesting here that true and good are very, very much alike. Not only are they entangled in some way, in the sense that there are, in fact, I'll jump one slide later and only grab that one point. They're entangled. You can't specify the one without the other, because there are truths about what is good, and truths are particular goods. It's good to be honest with yourself. It's good to understand this, right? Things like that. So truths are particular goods, and there are truths about what is good. The claim is that it's good for you to be able to listen carefully to other people's points of view, right? That's a truth about what is good. So they're entangled in that way, but they're also really a lot alike. In one case, there's an inclination to bring about something that isn't yet here, or to continue to retain a state of affairs that is here, to hold on to some enjoyment. In the other sense, there's a kind of inclination also, but we call it something different. It's assent, right? We see the world this way, and we're inclined to hold on to that way of looking at the world. because we think it's valuable for us. We think we've got it right. It coheres with everything else. And as more information floods in, it doesn't cause us to change our assent. As more information flooding in doesn't cause us to change our inclination about a judgment in which it's true that it's good for us. Right? If it's really good for us, if it's true that it's good for us, that more information does not cause us to change our inclination. And in the same way, more information does not cause us to change our judgments. We give assent to certain judgments. It seems this way to us, right?
Yeah.
And we say it is this way. And more information reinforces that and doesn't cause, in this case, it wouldn't be quite regret. It would be change of mind. It would be admission of error, right? And reformulation, not a new inclination to something else, although it would also be that, but primarily it would be a new acceptance, right? A new assent, an assent to some other answer. And although those don't always come together, sometimes something gets defeated and you don't know what to put in its place, right? And now you're just inclined to look. So there's this rich interplay between things that information produces both of them in us. The flow of information produces both of them, and there's a kind of inclination involved in both of them, and they're intertwined in some way. And there's a stability is the key, I'm suggesting, to what is good. It's stable inclination, and what is true is something to which I give stable assent. And there's a subjunctive variety. I would continue to assent to it were I to know what all the things that, and of course I may not know when I have this full information, but all the things that might matter.
It seems like a veil of ignorance here would be good as well.
How so?
I think just with regards to how you would want things to be for other people, right? Like, why should I care about, I guess I'm trying to, why should I care about the condition of people in Africa or people who I won't ever see on this model? Like, why,
you asking me why is it right for you to do that? Why should you? Or why is it good for you to do it?
Is it good for me to care about what happens to people on the other side of the world?
Or is it true right that you ought to care about their good?
Both of those things.
Yeah, right. There's a whole complex of stuff here, right?
Yeah.
Well, the short answer is it is better.
I guess
you live a life you're going to be inclined to hold on to if you are formed in such a way as to care about them. Your life is richer when you care about them, and you are disinclined to de-enrich in it. You are disinclined to say, the hell with those people. My life would be a lot simpler without them.
Yeah.
Yes, it would be simpler without them, but it would not be as rich. And as a matter of fact, as you explore your option sets if you explore your option sets widely and gain the perspective imaginatively, if you come to understand what the life of a person who has deep commitment to a wide range of human beings and imaginatively enter into and feel what that interior life is like, so that you can tell their stories, tell their jokes, write their poetry, enter into their relationships, right? All of those sorts of things, you'd say, oh, I get it.
That's a richer way of being in the world.
Yeah.
I'm fairly convinced by consequentialist arguments, and I'm trying to figure out how to map what we're talking about onto that.
Good.
And I think, I think what you just described is a good way of thinking about that. But I guess that's just where I'm at.
Reading Peter Singer again.
Yeah,
I mean, you mentioned him before, right? And are
I know.
impressed by
Yeah.
the clarity and the kind of honesty and the kind of challenge, right? That he is quite a master at crystallizing for us.
Mm-hmm.
But he is a consequentialist. And
Yeah.
so are you suggesting, now, why would consequentialism rise here unless you were talking about particular class of truths that have to do with what is right? And that we could just as well add in here. I hadn't in today, but I could have dropped another bullet point in because something is right.
What's the difference between right and good?
Sure. Sure. I might have an analysis of this is my good. This is a whole range of goods for me. This is a whole range of goods for you.
Yeah.
But it's a good question.
And maybe there isn't a shortish answer to this, but
no, I think there is. What's the best course of action for me? How am I inclined as a mature member of a rich community? How am I inclined to deal with the claims that other people have? Other people have inclinations. They have, call them needs if those inclinations are not yet realized, right? They're inclined to eat. They're inclined to do all kinds of things, right? Be treated with respect, be rescued from grave physical harm. We could make that list long fast, right? They're inclined to do that. Those are something like needs, we could say. Under what conditions is it a need that a mature member is inclined in a stable way to satisfy?
yeah.
And I would call those things rights.
Mm.
That's what a right is. It's a need that it's in the best interests of everyone to ensure is satisfied, and best interests are makes reference to precisely this informed desire account of you become the kind of person you're going to want to be glad you became and want to continue to be, right? Insofar as you learn to recognize the importance of these claims that other people make. They're simply their inclinations, including inclinations to have you change your behavior. It could be to help them. It could be to stop harming them, etc. Right?
Yeah.
And insofar as you're inclined to give those considerations weight, to recognize, right, that this is something that matters to you, then their claims have a force on you. It's the force of inclination, right? That is this subjectively grounded inclination. It's the inclination that you would have were you formed to maturity, were your choices to be optimally in causal contact with information about your options, which is what it is to be formed to maturity. You could say, in a sense, it's the wrong answer. When you leave that guy by the side of the street and the Good Samaritan doesn't go over to help him, right? He's made the wrong computation. It's the wrong answer. According to whom? According to him. It's his wrong answer. It's not how he would be inclined to act were he in contact with information about his options that he would recognize as relevant information about his options or hers. Something like that is, now that may be that sounds too good to be true, and we ought to go after it with a machine gun, right? And poke all kinds of holes in it, challenge it. But that's the basic direction of the flow. The flow of life.
Yeah. I need to, yeah.
And this is a resurrection then of a natural law. It's to say you and I are actually not very different about how we ought to care about other human beings. And what I mean by ought here is the same ought that you don't tug on Superman's cape, you don't spit in the wind, right? You ought not to do that, buddy. Right? That's a big mistake. It's a big mistake to ignore the people right next to you. It's a big mistake not to care about them, right? Not to go and do whatever you can. Says who? Says you. Says the mature you, if you may not be formed yet well, but insofar as you are, right, you will not be inclined. If insofar as you are raised up in the way you should go, you will not depart from it. To use that line from, I think it's from Proverbs, right? Raise up a child in which she should go, and when she's old, she won't depart from it. That is it's possible to form people that way. And when you form them that way, they achieve a stable state, which really is a state of other regardingness. These people matter to them. You matter to me, right? And that does not go away. It might go away from drugs. It might go away from all kinds of stupid behavior that we would have cause to later regret. But in a mature tradition, there is a whole consistent, coherent way of becoming a person. It's an answer. It's a computed answer. How should human beings fit together? How do we live together, process information together, achieve our good together? We're computing that. And some traditions have got more on the ball in that regard. Some approaches have got more on the ball. They're responding to more information than others. This is computational natural law. And this is missing. This idea, I can tell you, is as far as I can tell, it's missing from the contemporary discussion. The phrase computational natural law is one I've never heard anywhere.
Yeah.
But it is very much a McIntyre sort of direction, I think. But it incorporates some new resources that McIntyre hasn't himself yet thought. He doesn't think in terms of information processing, or rather, he doesn't speak that way. I say that because he's a very well-informed individual, so he may very well think that way now. But he probably didn't 70 years ago when he started thinking about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we're done for today, and we will go on to conscious realism the very next time, and we're well prepared for it now. That way of thinking about what is true and what is good, I'm going to suggest makes conscious realism of Donald Hoffman's kind not a strange conclusion, but actually an inevitable conclusion. And I could be wrong about that, but that's what I'm going to try and argue next time. And if it turns out it's right, and if it turns out you can drag in conscious realism, all of its resolutions to problems in quantum mechanics, its in relativity, and all the other things he thinks it can resolve, if you can drag all that stuff together, never mind the hard problem of consciousness resolved, right? And a problem which is central to neuroscience, absolutely central, because we're in there paying attention to the brain. What do we say about the brain? What do we say about consciousness? When does it emerge, et cetera? Huge set of problems. If we could pull answers like that are emerging, and grab that whole fabric and harmonize it with this high information flow network of rich community epistemology, this information processing epistemology, there would be a certain kind of a natural connectedness, sort of an interdependence of progress in one area on progress in another area. And that is precisely what I'm trying to say one of these buildings looks like, that we need to build on this new high information flow network of rich community infrastructure. That the end point of that craft is a holistic account of the world. What on earth would that look like? This is what it would look like. It would look like a network of mutually reinforcing solutions that fit together in a whole. And for a variety of reasons, we need to go in this direction. The project would collapse, it turns out, I think, if we couldn't go in this direction for reasons we haven't talked about yet. But it also looks pretty cool if we could go in this direction. So, but I mean, it looks at least appealing, right? If you can bring together a lot of things that harmonize and that offer new solutions to problems in other areas. The word we would be using there is fecundity. We're looking for consistency and we're looking for fecundity. When you bring these things together, you end up getting more. You get synergistic interaction between these various positions. That's the hope. And even if I'm dead wrong about all these things, at least the psychological construct we will build, we may have to tear this building down because it doesn't stand anymore. You know what I mean, to build that analogy. But it stands long enough that you can take a quick tour before it gets condemned. And it looks like a functioning building, right? It's just maybe this isn't the one, if you know what I mean. This is risky business. How can you put together everything? You have to be an expert at everything. Nobody is. I'm certainly not. But that doesn't mean you can't put things together well enough that you can see what such a building would look like. What it would, and what are some of the properties that that are marks of a successful whole. And this is Plato, and we'll talk about that someday too.
Sweet.
Okay.
All right.
We've run over, and I should let you go. It's probably we should have done that a long time ago.
I guess so. Next time we're talking about conscious realism.
I think so. We're going to do these next two steps on Monday.
Okay.
And then think about what we ought to do on Wednesday.
Okay. I listened to Donald Hoffman was on Sam Harris's podcast.
Was he? When?
This past January.
Okay. Haven't heard that. I'd love to hear that.
And so Sam Harris's wife, Annika Harris, wrote a book recently.
Both are actually, but yeah.
And she worked really closely with Donald Hoffman, actually.
That I didn't know. Cool.
So anyway, this podcast, she's on it. So it's her and Sam together interviewing Donald Hoffman, and it's a 3-hour conversation.
Oh, I am so in. Can't believe I haven't seen
it. I listened to it today. It was a great conversation, and I feel like I understand what Donald Hoffman was saying a lot better in light of it.
Nice.
Like the paper made more sense to me, and then also just his project as a whole makes more sense.
Good. Well, he's about
highly
to
recommend the conversation.
Excellent. I will look that up. Yep, I'll look it up, and I will take it. I started a letter to Donald Hoffman, by the way, and I'll run it by you before, and we'll see.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys. Great to spend some time with you.
Yeah, great seeing you guys.
Good conversation.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I hear Mariel and a little one in your background. Is that right?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't know how loud they were.
Oh, that was awesome. Not too loud, delightful.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
By the way, let me end this recording and say thanks to everybody who listened in. Only that one has stopped. Stop the live stream.